Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Liz England. I'm a designer at Insomniac Games, and this talk is titled Transitioning from Linear to Open World Design with Sunset Overdrive. So to give you a little bit of a reference point before we dive into that, I do want to point out that last year was Insomniac's 20th year anniversary. So they've been around for a really, yes, clap, please. They've been around for a really long time. And in all those years, we've made a lot of games. Now, I obviously haven't been there for those 20 years, just for a small portion of that. So I can't talk to our processes that entire time. But there's one thing that most of these games have in common, and that's that they have really linear gameplay. These are linear games. And so obviously we had a lot of processes in place, and we had, this sort of well-oiled machine thing going on at Insomniac where we could make, linear games. We knew how to do that. And a lot of things kind of changed when we moved to open world, because open world is its own beast. It has its own challenges. And so this talk is a lot about how we adapted to those challenges from the point of view of the design department, right? Because I am a designer. So to give you an overview of this talk, the first thing I'm going to go over is, what do we really mean by linear gameplay? What do we really mean by an open world game? And there's a different ways you can describe these, but I have my own personal one. And then I'm going to cover, how did the roles and responsibilities of designers at Insomniac change when we moved from these linear games to this open world game to tackle that new challenge? Obviously, as the roles changed, our workflow changed, right? And so I'm going to cover, how did our workflow change in implementing systems, spaces, and content in this open world game? And then the last thing I'm going to cover is, what were the side effects of these changes? Both the side effects of moving to open world, because that is its own thing, but also, we made changes that worked for us, and those changes also had ripple effects on creation of games. So I'm going to go over those pros and cons at the end of this presentation. And throughout this, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting, our process on linear games. And I'll use Resistance 3 as the example, since I've worked on that one. And then as our open world example, obviously, I'm going to use Sunset Overdrive. So these are my compare and contrast whenever it's appropriate. With that said, I'm going to dive right in to what do we mean by a linear game and what do we mean by an open world game. And again, there's a lot of different ways you can phrase these, and I'm just going to pick one, right? So if I were to give you a piece of paper, right, and tell you, draw me a linear game structure, you might come up with something like this, right? A series of nodes with lines, and A goes to B, goes to C, goes to D. It's a deterministic order, right? If you want to go from A to C, you always go through B. This is pretty self-explanatory. And then if I were to tell you, okay, now draw an open world game, that might be a little bit more difficult, but it usually looks like some kind of spider web, right? So you can go from A to B to C again, or you can go from A to D to C and then back to A again. And the deal here is that it's non-linear. It's non-deterministic. You don't know where the player is necessarily, or where they're going to go next, or where they last came from, unlike a linear game. But if you look at these nodes a little bit more closely, right, there's one thing to just write a little thumbnail of a node. But what do these nodes really mean? Well, in a linear game, A, B, C, they represent not just a series of events in a timeline. They actually represent concrete spaces in a linear game. So when we're talking about linear game, we're talking about, in space A, our events A, right? If this is a combat arena, there's a certain kind of combat going on, and the next space is maybe a story space, and then there's story going on. But you don't shuffle those events, right? And in an open world, it's a bit different, right? Because when you look at these nodes, they could represent spaces, right? So I move between these spaces in any direction or order I want, but also could represent events, right? So like what is happening is kind of divorced from where the player is. Events can happen in any variety of spaces. So these are disconnected. Now these are like pure linear and pure open world, and there's very few things. I don't think there are games that are purely linear, and I'm sure there's games that are purely open world. I haven't found one. We're pretty close to the end of open world, and there's, room in between here. Now, when you look at these nodes, and my description of like the space and like the series of events, the thing I want you to take away is that in a linear game, if you know where the player is, you get a ton of information about the game state. In an open world game, just by knowing where the player is, you don't actually have a lot of information about the rest of the game. There's a lot of things going on in those spaces. So if you were to look at this in To use an example of a different medium, the reading medium, which some of you might be familiar with. So a linear reading material would be a book, right? So if the reader is on page 359, you know exactly what they've read ahead before, you know exactly what they still have to read. If you take a non-linear reading material like a wiki page, right, just by knowing what page the reader's on, you don't actually know what pages they've already read, you don't know what pages they have yet to read. So how does this apply to video games, obviously, right? Like, what is a page in a video game? So for me, a page is a screenshot, right? So if I take a screenshot of Resistance 3, right, this is my page. This is where the player is in the game. And you ask the question based on where the player is, what do we know about the game state? And so in the case of Resistance 3, which is a linear game, it's a deterministic game, I know the player's in the boat level, so we ask what is known and what is unknown. In this case, you know, we know a whole lot about the game. I know that they're probably about 2 hours into the game, they're at the end of the boat level, so the boat's about to sink, sorry, spoilers. I know which enemies they've met, I know which weapons they have, I know which tutorials they've encountered, I know where they are in the storyline. There's a whole bunch of stuff I know. And there's a handful of things I don't know, right? I don't know if they're in a co-op. Don't know if they have a co-op buddy. I don't know what difficulty level they're on. The weapons leveled up based on how often the player used them, so that was another variable that you don't actually know. And I don't know, maybe the player's playing this game for the 5th time because they really like the game. But as a designer, if I were to be given this space and be told, okay, here's your space, make all the events in this space, well, it's like, well, I know all this stuff about the game, so my number of variables are pretty small. There's just a few things like co-op and difficulty that I'll have to take into account, but it's pretty much a known quantity. Now take an open world game like Sunset Overdrive. Right, here's a screenshot of Area 2 in Little Tokyo. Screenshot I know really well. This is one of the first areas we built. So based on where the player is in the game, what do we know about the game state, right? What's our known and unknown? Well, for sure we know that they completed the tutorial because we know that they're no longer the tutorial space. That's the only linear space. And then what else? I mean, unfortunately, we don't know anything else really about the game state based on where they are because it's an open world game. They could be 30 minutes into the game or 30 hours into the game or 300 hours into the game. They could be on a mission. They could just be futzing around in the world. They could be in a multiplayer match. We don't know what weapons they have. We don't know what abilities they have. We don't know where they've really explored. There's so much stuff that's unknown. So if you were to give this space to a designer and say, okay, here's your space, make all the different events in this space, was like, well, okay, let me just make the entire game, right? Like, that's how it feels. There's just an overwhelming number of possibilities that could happen in this space. So this is sort of a core thought process, or this is my thought process behind, linear versus open world or linear versus nonlinear, and kind of like the way the structure of the game changes is going to affect, what kind of work designers have to do in those spaces. So that leads me to part 2. Role of designers. And in part 2, I want to cover, what was a designer's role on Resistance 3, on a linear game? And this might surprise some people, but on Resistance 3, all designers were generalists, right? So a designer was able to do anything a designer could do in the game, right? We're all responsible for all the things. But we chunked it up, right? So designers own discrete spaces, right? So you give designer a level or 3 levels, right? And that's their spaces, right? There's pages that they have to worry about in the book. And then the designer was responsible for implementing all the gameplay in that space, right? So they would be implementing, the geometry. So they do the white boxing and they prototype the gameplay. They do the combat and the puzzles, the missions, organize with other departments, all that other stuff, everything that a designer would do in a space, right? And all the events in that space had one owner. And this really works really well in that linear kind of gameplay, right? Where you can chunk up the events of the game. You can give the first chapter to the first person, second chapter to the second person. And then really the things you had to worry about were the transitions between your level and the previous level and the next level. And that kind of works, It's not the only way to do it, but it really worked for us. However, when you went to open world, it was a little bit different. And a little bit, I mean a lot different. You couldn't really chunk up the world that way because we didn't know what was going on in those spaces, right? It wasn't just, one kind of gameplay. It was all different kinds of gameplay going on in the space. Remember, that possibility space was big. So the way we dealt with that was design generalists became design specialists, right? And instead of, all designers being responsible for all the different kinds of content, we would split it up. So on Sunset Overdrive, our open world game, designers are specialists. And specialists means we own systems, not spaces. And so each designer was responsible for a specific system or a set of systems, and we implemented that one system across all the spaces. So what you might want to ask is, who makes the spaces? I'll get into that a little bit later. But we own systems, right? So this is kind of how I would describe, I'll get into that in a minute. So I would describe this as, a vertical versus a horizontal kind of structure. Although if you flip the images around, they might be the opposite, right? So vertical would mean, each person has their level and all the gameplay in that level. And that would be our linear games. And then in our open world games, we'd have, each person would have a system across all the levels. And so that's sort of that compare and contrast. And as you might guess, this had a major effect on how designers worked. But first I want to mention, when I say system, what is a system? I'm not actually asking that question because I don't want to answer that really specifically. But when I think about systems and how we separated Sunset Overdrive responsibilities into systems, what we were really looking at was verbs, right? What is the player doing in a space, right? Because a player's set of actions and their goals are really is a thing that you could wrap your head around and say, I can design for that, right? You can't necessarily design for all the actions and all the verbs, with the way that our game was designed. But we could design for one set of them. So some of these verbs might be a player's moving through the space. They're moving, they're traversing. That's the traversal system. And they're fighting enemies. Well, that's the combat system. And they're completing objectives. That's a mission or quest system. And they're searching for loot. That's an open world system. And they're competing or cooperating. And that's a multiplayer system. And we had more than this, right? These were kind of our major systems and breakdown. And so each of these systems was one of those layers, right? And it wasn't necessarily one designer, right? The combat system was actually 3 to 4 designers at a given time. So it wasn't necessarily one designer did a thing, but that combat team was responsible for all the combat across the board of the entire game. Now, before I go on to my next part, I do want to kind of answer the question of, why specialists, why now? I know a lot of studios already specialize in designers. I mean, my title is designer. It's not level designer or combat designer. We're all designers. And this worked for a really long time and gave us a lot of flexibility with our work. And we never really ran into problems with that. But, why specialists? Why now? Why did we specialize with Sunset Overdrive? Some of those answers are specific to the game, and some of them are specific to how we work. So I want to go into those specifics. So the first reason why we specialized was this sort of rise of systems. So this was kind of really early on when we knew we were going to open world. We've all played open world games. And we knew that we just did not have the bandwidth to create 30 or 40 or 50 hours of handcrafted content for players. We just wouldn't be able to do it. We didn't have enough people, and we didn't have enough time to do that. And we knew we had to rely on some of the systems to create this sort of compelling, or the player's interaction with systems to create compelling gameplay. And the other part of it is, too, when you think of open world games, you're like, oh, there's a playground feel, right? You're going to play around in the city. Well, that's unstructured play. That is all about the systems, right? So we knew kind of early on that we had to rely on systems. The other thing I really want to mention, because I'm going to dive into this a bit more, is traversal, right? Our traversal system is a really major part of Sunset Overdrive and has a huge impact on the rest of the game. In particular, it has a huge impact on geometry. So for the next few points, I'm going to use traversal and geometry as my example, but actually all these points apply to all of our systems. So the next point is, the importance of metrics and rules. So with traversal, for example, we had to worry about how long was a wall run? How wide was a wall run? If the player is going to grind on a grind rail, if it was 8 meters long, then it was less than a second of grinding, and maybe that was okay, but most of the time it wasn't. So what was the right length of a grind rail? How far away were buildings apart if you wanted to jump from one to the other? There's all these kinds of metrics that were going on with traversals for lengths and heights, and all that stuff needed someone to define all those metrics, but then also kind of I mean, for lack of a better word, police them to make sure that they're really getting implemented and they're being followed, and they're being followed by everybody on the team. So we knew we needed someone who was in charge of traversal. And then the next point is coordination with other departments. So obviously AAA games, you always have to coordinate with other departments, but it got a lot trickier on Sunset Overdrive. So for example, with traversal, right? And traversal and level design kind of go together. All kinds of stuff in our game was all this stuff that art would normally put, like environment artists would normally put into a game, now afforded some sort of gameplay opportunity, right? So when normally you could just, place objects wherever you want, now we had to place objects very carefully because pretty much anything larger than a pizza box could be a gameplay object, right? Could affect your traversal path, could either stop you and break your momentum or allow you to continue traversing through it. We had objects like cars and railings and bushes and air conditioner units and fans and wires and pretty much all those kinds of things. Those were all gameplay objects because you could traverse on them. So we had to be placing them to those traversal metrics. And you have to remember that, in most games, a blank wall is a blank wall. And art can do whatever they want to it. But in us, in Sunset Overdrive, a blank wall meant you can wall run here. It was now part of the critical path. So even the placement of buildings and walls to that extent, and where corners were and how sharp those corners were, they all had very specific metrics, and that led to the coordination between the art department and the traversal system, right? Like they had to be on the same level. And that kind of coordination was a lot of meetings, was a lot of going back and forth and making sure that those rules were followed. So that's the coordination with other departments. Another thing that came in was new tech specific to open world, because remember, this is our first open world game. So we created a whole bunch of new stuff that we had never used before. So we didn't have people already experienced in this tech. And that meant we needed specialists who could relate to how that tech involved with a system. So in our system of level design and traversal, I'll give you a few examples. So we had this modularized art system. And if you've seen the art talk, then you'll know how cool this was. And basically, simplifying, but you could take a designer white box that was maybe 30 meters by 20 meters by 40 meters, and an artist could go select it, press a button, simplifying, press a button, and all of a sudden turn it into all the different wall pieces, the ceiling pieces, the columns, and then go in and replace the walls with a storefront and change the color, and now, we have a really cool looking building. And it was really fast, and we needed to be really fast because we had a small art team compared to a lot of other departments, or a lot of other studios. So the modular art system was really important, but that also meant that that white boxing stage had to fit certain rules, and the art department needed to communicate with design and back and forth, and we had to fit those rules as well as our traversal rules. Next, we had things like the hex-based streaming system. So we actually had, in our linear games, we would have go down a corridor, then go through an airlock, then go through another corridor, and it didn't really matter what angles they were or how long they were. Hex-based is different, right? So all our content was built into hexes, and as you're moving out of these areas, things are streaming in and out on the fly. So where do you put a building? Can you put it on the edge of a hex? If one loads out, is the building still there? Is only part of the building still there, right? And what angles do you put things in? Because hexes have these 30-degree angles. And so we were kind of restricted in ways that we hadn't been restricted before. In terms of how we build stuff. And then another piece of new tech was that we had, I couldn't find a good screenshot of this, but we had a tool that generated roads and sidewalks and populated them with, textures and stuff like that, but also, cars and telephone poles and wires, and all those things were gameplay objects, and we needed to integrate that into the game. And so all these things needed to be kind of coordinated, and this new tech needed to be understood, but we didn't have enough time for everyone to understand all the new tech because all the different systems had their own new systems in. So we needed someone to focus on that. And the last thing I want to mention is this tradition of hand-scripted gameplay. And this is probably kind of specific to Insomniac, right? Because we've had systems in our games before, and then as soon as the designers get the chance, we go in and we force that system to do our bidding with hand-scripted gameplay. Sure, enemies might have AI that allow them to flank and defend and advance, and then we will go in and say, no, I want that enemy right here. Nowhere else. It has to be there. Because that's best for that experience, and it's sort of this intentional thing, and we did that a lot in a lot of our games, and it gave the programmers a lot of headaches. But we've always done that. So when we moved to this sort of systems-based thing, no one really wanted to let go of all that hand-scripted, intentional stuff, but we had to. So we made a compromise, essentially. And the compromise was, okay, we won't hand-script stuff, but you're going to give us a lot of markup to put around the world, so we can make it look like it's hand-scripted, but it's not really. So what we ended up doing was, for most of our systems, had a lot more markup than probably was ideal, but that was sort of the trade-off we made, you know? And that meant that, you know, if you're doing combat, you might not be hand-scripting combat, you might not be able to tell an enemy to go to a specific place, but you're going to go through the entire world to give the enemies as much information about the context of what they're in, the geometry around them, how they're able to move through those spaces. And that required a lot of time, you know, there was a lot of time implementing markup. And so all those kinds of things combined, right? And I talked mostly about traversal and level design, but all these, you know, the systems, the metrics and rules, coordinating with new departments, new tech, that hand-scripted gameplay, all that was a full-time job for any given system, right? There was just a lot of things to ramp up on, a lot of things to be new about. So that's why we turned to specialists, right? Fragment our team and allow them to become specialized and learn all these new tools about their thing. And don't worry about all the new tools and all the new, like, I don't know how the modularized art system works. I just know it does. Because I wasn't part of that team to worry about that. So that brings me to part 3, which is workflow. So obviously when we change, you know, from that vertical approach to that horizontal approach, the way we built a space, the way we built a system, the way we implemented content changed a lot. And so I'm going to go over those now, right? So we're going to do a compare contrast. Systems is a pretty easy one to wrap your head around, right? So in Resistance 3, you know, we started out with a designer. Now remember, all designers owned a physical chunk of the world, right? And we implemented all the gameplay in it. So who owned the systems? Well, we also own the systems, right? So I might be responsible for 3 levels and 2 systems. The systems might be things like doors and combat, right? Like those are my systems. Someone else owns co-op, and someone else owns objectives and stuff like that. So I would own a level, but then I'd also own a system. I would work with, or I would define the system, right? The needs of the system. What do we need the system to do? I work with the gameplay programmer to create the system, to figure out what kind of markup we need, how are we going to implement it. And then I sit down with all the other designers and I tell them how to implement it, right? And remember, I own a level too, so I'm going to implement it too. So if it was combat, right? I'm going to sit down, we're going to design the combat system. I might even go into my level first and implement combat to test it out. But then we're all going to have a meeting with all the designers and here's how you put combat in your levels. And everyone's going to go put combat in their own levels. Everyone was expected to be ramped up on these systems together. And I would not go into Lisa's level to edit her combat. That was her responsibility. And then on Sunset Overdrive, it changed, right? So the designer, you know, defines the system, just as like before. They work with the gameplay programmer to create the system, and then they implement it, right? And they implement it across all the spaces. So that's pretty clear. Kind of go over that already. The next thing I want to talk about is spaces and content. It's really hard to divide these up into just spaces and just content. I want to talk about content. I'm talking about things like the gameplay in those spaces. Because it's just a space, there's not gameplay, there's gameplay in the space. It's hard to divide these up, so I've just wrapped them together. Now in Resistance 3, again, this shouldn't be a surprise, we have a designer, right? And they white box the space, they prototype the gameplay, they work with an artist to define the visuals and deal the architectural tweaks and stuff like that, and they'll go back and forth. Other departments will come in and add their layers, and then designer iterates, and then they bug fix and polish. And the important thing here is that the designer is not ever moving their level to a different designer. No one else is going into their level, right? It's just the designer's level is all theirs. We did not hand off our spaces. The only time we ever handed off a level was when we had to make major changes where, you know, someone was loaded with work, so we'd pass a level off. But if I passed my level to Lisa, you know, it was no longer my level. It was Lisa's level. She was now the owner. The ownership was never temporary. It was always a permanent thing. Sunset Overdrive is a lot more complicated, and you have to forgive me for the flowcharts. I've tried various ways to visualize this. It's not very easy. So we don't start with a designer. I mean, we do, but we have specialists now, so we start with a world builder. Now, our world builders were traversal designers. So that's how I talked about how traversal and level design were really paired together. So our world builder white boxes the spaces, going back and forth with the other departments on them. And then they would add this thing that I call the traversal layer. And that's, you know, basic traversal objects, right? Things that allow you to grind and bounce and move and climb through the city in a very basic way, not super polished. But the other half of the traversal layer was marking out the critical path. Right? In a linear game, that critical path it's not a straight arrow, it's a jagged arrow and it's going to still go in one direction. And in an open world game, just like that node graph, it's going to be a spider web. So we actually had these spider webs of yellow arrows moving through the space. And what that did was it told you that if you were looking at this space, what the paths in and out of that space were that connected all the other spaces, right? To make sure that we were making this open world game that was integrated with all the other spaces. And so the traversal designers or world builders are looking at this from a very high level point of view at the city. They're whiteboxing the spaces and they're creating that traversal that both gets the player to move through those spaces but also tells everyone else where those big movement paths are that they can't change. The next thing they did was they split the area into blocks. Now when I talk about blocks, I'm talking about city blocks, right? We had roads in between, right? And roads are kind of conduits between areas. But most of our blocks were city blocks or they were halves of blocks. And these were things like thematically separate areas. These were places like playground or parks, right? Or schoolyards or parking garages and malls and courtyards and so on and so forth, right? Each of them had kind of this distinct feel. And so the players would naturally understand it as kind of a separate space, but it was still really well integrated to the rest of the space. So we divided into blocks and then we'd hand off the spaces. Right? And we'd hand those spaces off to different specialists. And these are 3 of them that probably had the most space. And then the combat designers, the mission designers, and the multiplayer designers. And when they hand those spaces off, right, traversal designers hands off, not them, they're going off to the next area, to the next part of the world to continue their white box and traversal layer iterations. But now we have each of these specialists, and when they go into these spaces, they're optimizing the space. When I say optimize, I don't mean from a technical standpoint. I mean from a gameplay standpoint. So if you go back here again, you see how it's color-coded. If you're not colorblind, sorry if you're colorblind. Combat spaces were green, right? And what combat space meant was that just the area was optimized for a good combat arena. It was still, first and foremost, an area that you could traverse through and was connected to all the other spaces. The next layer was also, it was really good for combat, right? It wasn't just for combat. It was just optimized for, arena combat with the way the player moves through the spaces and things like that. And we did the same thing with, say, multiplayer designers would take over spaces and say, okay, we're going to optimize this for 8 players, right? And just because a space was good for 8 players didn't mean it wasn't good in single player anymore. Like, it was still good, right? So they just optimized these spaces in specific ways. And so when they're optimizing the space, they're also finalizing the geometry. And I don't mean final. I mean the end of the white box stage. The stage at which art can come in and start modularizing the boxes. The point at which the space is ready for gameplay, right? Like we're not really prototyping gameplay in white box because we don't know where all those traversal things are, and a lot of things about the spaces change. But now once the spaces feel like they're in the right spot, the heights are there, we know where our buildings are, we know where the connections are, the geometry is finalized, and then it's ready for gameplay. And so when I say gameplay, what I'm referring to, in our case, is gameplay content, which is instanced layers, and then we called those overlays. We use whatever word you want to describe them. They're basically instanced. And so everybody would add layers of gameplay, and you didn't have to see the other layers at the same time. That way we could share the space and all work simultaneously on those layers. And I'll give you an example of what some of those layers are. So this is, again, a close-up of our city. And this is a working map that we actually used on Sunset Overdrive to try to organize what is the gameplay in all these spaces, because you can't visualize it in our tools very well. We had to create another way of visualizing what is being used in these spaces. So the first one layer would be missions, right? And one layer is a misnomer, right? Because really is each mission is its own layer, and there were some 35 missions. So there's 35 layers here, right? And each of them existed simultaneously, but yet you could work in only one and not see the others. And then you had quests, added on, and then you had challenges, and I'm missing some challenges here. And then you had multiplayer objective stuff, and then you had collectibles, and like just the layers, like once you see all of it together, you're like, wow, this world is really full of gameplay. But most of the time, you're just looking at it with only your gameplay up, right? You're not actually looking at all the other stuff unless you're playing it through progression. And I'll get into some of the side effects of that later. So the sort of top-down look at this spaces and content workflow for Sunset Overdrive was you create that basic open world structure, right? With a big area, right? You make sure that it's connected to all the spaces. The traversal is in there. You know where your critical paths are, and art has signed off on where all the landmarks are. Then you create an identity for that space, right, with your specialists. You create your combat spaces. You say, okay, these spaces are mission landmarks. Major mission events are going to happen. But first they have to be tied into that open world spider web, but then they can have their own identity. Then you add your gameplay layers, right, which are missions, quests, challenges, multiplayer, open world, combat. And those were not all of them, but those were most of our major types of layers in the game. And obviously you're going to iterate on those layers, and those have another path going on. When it comes to geometry, the next step is, geometry iteration. And geometry iteration is actually kind of this minor tug of war between different points, right? Because the people who are mostly in charge of geometry are the traversal designers, who are going to keep going back and keep going through spaces to make sure that traversal markup is following those rules and those metrics, right? And then you're going to have artists going through and trying to art up the spaces, and they're going to want to tweak and move and shift things around. And then you also have that secondary owner, right? That combat designer in the combat arenas, the mission designer, the mission landmarks. And so all three of those are kind of do this sort of like mini tug of war, where they're each going to kind of iterate in the space and then go back and forth until you kind of feel like it's final, right? And then everyone is responsible in those spaces for bug fixing and polishing. And so that's how spaces and content worked in Sunset Overdrive. It's a much more complex workflow, but it was a very clear step-by-step workflow throughout the entire time. So one way of kind of comparing and contrast Resistance 3 and Sunset Overdrive, because workflow is this big topic, right, is that question of do designers hand off work, and what kind of work are they handing off? And I don't just mean handing off, but also kind of sharing, right? And so in our linear game, right, when it comes to systems, right, in linear games we were sharing systems, right? You still had an owner, but everybody was implementing these systems. But in an open world game, right, you still had an owner, but no one else but the owners were really implementing that system. And then with spaces, it's the other way around. In a linear game, no one else is implementing a space except for the designer who owns it. But in open world, you have several owners implementing in the same space together. So that's kind of how workflow worked in Sunset Overdrive. So to kind of recap what I've talked about already. I talked about, what do we mean by a linear game? What do we mean by open world game? And I gave you that whole spaces and the events or the actions. And we'll just replace events with systems, right? So the systems in the space are necessarily not necessarily tied to a space. Although there's one exception, which is, you can still have linear mission objectives, right? And those can be tied to spaces. But when I'm in a space, I don't know if I'm on that mission objective or I'm on a different system going on. And then the next is, how did the roles and responsibilities of designers change? And I talked about that, right? We went from generalists to specialists. We went from owners of spaces to owners of systems. Had workflow change in implementing systems, spaces, and content. And that is, that handoff. A lot of our systems work was actually very intertwined, and separating, how we developed spaces from how we developed the rest of our content that was layered onto those spaces. And the last thing I want to talk about today is what were the side effects, which is kind of a doozy, right? We went into open world, and open world has its own challenges. And then we made a whole bunch of changes, right, to how we worked, and that has its own problems. And so the side effects are, the good and the bad. But before I go into the side effects, one thing I want to point out is that this is, a talk about Sunset Overdrive, right, which is a very specific kind of open world game. We have this traversal system that has a huge impact on all levels of design in the game. And that means you can compare and contrast our game with a game like Skyrim or GTA, and we're all open world games, so there's lessons to be learned. But at the same time, we have our own unique challenges, right? And there's major difference between, say, Sunset Overdrive and Skyrim, right? And so I only have experience with Sunset Overdrive. I've not worked on any other open world games. So I can't really tell you which of these lessons are all open world games, will be affected by this. I can only tell you about what happened with us, and I'll let you to take away which of them work for your project and which of them maybe are affected by your company culture as opposed to our culture or the way we organize things. So that's my disclaimer for the talk. And now we'll go into side effects, right? Which is the good and the bad, or more like the bad and the good, because I'm going to leave the good for last. We're going to go over the bad parts first. Just get it out of the way. Pull off the Band-Aid. So feedback lag from leads. So what happened is, this is a combination of things, right? So we had more people on the team, a lot more, right? We probably had more than twice the number of designers we've had before, but we still had the same number of leads. So how are they supposed to review going from 8 hours of content to 30 hours of content? You know, we're not going to get the feedback at the rate that we're used to, and we're not going to get quite as much oversight as we would have liked. And especially because we're specializing, we were actually developing content a lot faster than we had before, at least with this system. So, you know, one of the leads told me, you know, they say, okay, we'll put 5 designers in this space and they'll work on all the systems in this space, and then we'll review it by lunchtime. And unfortunately, you can only do that a couple times before you never have time in your life again to do anything except review other people's work. And there's just a lot of content going in. So it was up to designers to kind of take ownership over their stuff, right, and solicit a lot of peer feedback and peer review, and to kind of trust ourselves to do it right, maybe not the first time, but to iterate on it ourselves, right, and to review it themselves. It's not ideal, not a terrible thing. It would have been nice to get more feedback, but that was one of the side effects, right. The next is bottlenecks. So I think on any game you're going to run into bottlenecks. The bottlenecks in Sunset Overdrive were different than the ones we're used to in linear games, because when we normally start production on games, you know, it's like, okay, designers, we're starting production. Everyone, just hit the ground running and start building your white box, build your level, prototype your gameplay. We couldn't do that this time because we had to wait for the world builder to be done. And that took a really long time to get approval in that process. So there was a lot of bottleneck early on, waiting for the first spaces to be done. Everyone was just sort of waiting. Oh, is it done yet? It's done. No, 3 weeks from now. Okay, what do we do until then? And I'll get into that in a minute. So we had some bottlenecks. And we also had things like a combat designer couldn't go into a mission to update their combat, to refine their combat, if the mission didn't exist. The mission couldn't exist if the space didn't exist, right? And so we had some reliance on other things in ways that we hadn't before, and that created some bottlenecks. Although I will say that the workflow that we created ended up smoothing out a lot of those bottlenecks that we could have run into. Next, so during that first bottleneck, when we're waiting for the geometry to be built, something we did, which we normally do, is create prototype levels. And in my opinion, prototype levels delayed our transition into open world thinking as designers. Because when you're creating a prototype level, right, to prototype your system, you're only worried about your system. So you're creating this environment that works for a single use. But we're actually making a game where an environment needs to have multiple uses. So we had some problems from that. And so we're creating these single-use environments. Sometimes we're creating really linear gameplay, right? So we had missions where the spaces were actually not much different than a Resistance 3 level, because it was just a linear space that you walked through. But that didn't feel like an open-world game. But since it wasn't actually integrated into an open-world city, it wasn't immediately, I mean, it's really obvious on hindsight. It wasn't really immediate obvious on the ground. And the other thing is you're creating these spaces and they're not integrated into an open world, right? You're just creating a space to prototype combat. You're not thinking about how that space necessarily ties into the spaces around it. So prototype levels had some downsides for us. When I talked to some people, they said, you know, it might have just been better to create overlays in the open world and prototype right there, even if the geometry wasn't done, right? Just prototype right into the open world instead of in our separate prototype levels. The next thing I want to talk about is invisible conflicts between layers. And so this refers to, you know, how you could have 12 missions in the same space and none of them the mission designers could all work at the same time and not see each other's work. Well, the not seeing each other's work was a problem. It was useful for development because I don't have to worry about what else is going on. I can just worry about my mission. But when you're playing the game for real and you go into a faction base and there's 6 Margarets, you know there's a problem. But if you're only loading into your mission or only into your quest, you don't necessarily notice. So it took a bit longer than it should have to track down a lot of these conflicts, right? You'd have situations where you'd be standing next to an NPC and they'd be calling you on the phone because they've been captured by the enemy, right? And it's like, well, there's some dissonance going on here. We got to fix that. So there are invisible conflicts between layers. They're just like if you're making each designer has their own level and they're only worrying about the level before and after them, you could have those horse blinders on. You could still have horse blinders in this system. It's not a fix for that, right? And speaking of horse blinders, we also had problems with orphan systems. This is a bit of a pet peeve because my role, actually, if I had a real title, it would be adopter of orphan systems. That was my job. And so the problem with orphan systems meant when we moved to systems, right, we made sure every designer had a system, right? We didn't necessarily make sure every system had a designer. And if it wasn't your system, it was like, well, it'll get done eventually. So it was easy to kind of ignore some of the smaller systems, right? A really egregious example of this that makes people cry and laugh, and I'm doing both right now, is our NPC system. About 2 months before we shipped, we realized no one owned NPCs, which is a big problem because NPCs have really big impact on our memory and on constraints. And you go into missions, and like at one point, Ignatius be wearing a helmet, and the next point, he wouldn't be, and he's also dead and sick on the table, and he's standing up, and there's all kinds of things going, and sometimes lips didn't move, and sometimes they were wearing the wrong clothes, and all these things were just sort of like inconsistent. It never really stopped people from prototyping or implementing, which is why we didn't really notice it. We kind of noticed it, or people just didn't want to own it, right? It's a big system. So orphan systems was a problem, right? And I think if we were to go forward and continue with specialists and open world, we'd be a lot better with, making sure that we're tracking down all the systems in the game and that they all have coverage much earlier on. Then sort of discovering, when people need a system, oh no, no one owns it. Well, it's about to ship, so better get Liz on that. I told you it was a pet peeve. So the next bad one I want to mention, and it's not a huge one, but it's what I call hot potato bugs. So on Resistance 3, if I got a bug for St. Louis rescue level, that was my bug, right? I don't send that to any of the other designers because none of the other designers' responsibility for the bugs on my level. But now that we had all these systems, and the systems were intertwined, and pretty much every single designer went into every single mission to update the scripting, and people edited all kinds of stuff, and were sharing work, it was really easy to make the excuse that a bug wasn't really yours, it was someone else's system. Instead of maybe a bug on your side, it was a bug on their side. And so you get these bugs that are passed around kind of like musical chairs sometimes. It actually wasn't a huge problem, but it was much more noticeable than in Resistance 3. And I would say the only caveat with that, which is that the other departments might disagree. They might say the designers always sent them the bugs, and that was the hot potato thing. But between designers, we had hot potato bugs, and that was something that I noticed as a designer. So we'll talk about the good now, right? So the good. First one is rapid content creation. And that pairs with, I told you we had lag from leads to give feedback, and that's because we're creating content really fast. If you were in charge of challenges in our game, right, and challenges are these like mini game sort of things that you go in and like traverse from point A to point B or kill as many enemies as you can in the time limit. Once you made one, and you got approval for one, and one worked, and you could prove that it was fun, it was really easy to just copy and paste the basic components around the city. And then in that week, you could make 10 more. So we could create content really fast, and we were doing a lot of things smartly on the design side with sharing things like a component of a challenge. So we did not have a lot of little custom scripting. We could share, the scripting asset for a challenge and then just copy and paste it across the board. Fix one, you fix all of them. So rapid content creation was definitely a good thing, and it was kind of necessary because we made such a big game in kind of a short amount of time. And then the next thing that was really good was faster ramp up for team members. So Sunset Overdrive is the largest game that Insomniac, they tell me, right? I have not been around the whole time. Sunset Overdrive is the largest game that we've ever worked on. We had both of our studios working on it. I think we had almost everybody at the studio working on it at one point, and people over at Microsoft working on it too. And so when we hit production or when we had to roll on new members on the team, if it was the normal generalist way, right? Everyone would have to get ramped up on all the new tech, on all the new tools. Everyone would have to learn how to do open world tools because our old tools were all for linear games, so there's major changes there. And it just would have spent a lot of time learning stuff. And instead, when we had new people on the team, we could just say, okay, well, you're going to go on the combat team. And then the combat designers would adopt them into the fold and say, this is how combat works. And then they wouldn't have to worry about collectibles. They wouldn't have to worry about the objective system. They wouldn't have to worry about NPCs, unfortunately. And so on and so forth, right? So it was much faster to ramp up new team members with this new system on when all these things are new, right? Only present a small section of new stuff to them. Next, these are some really big ones that are good, that are going to offset those bads. So communication between designers. Now, I wouldn't say designers had bad communication before. We're pretty good about that. But when working on levels, it was easy to, like I said, those horse blinders. I only had to worry about the level before and after me. Sometimes you just would not play each other's levels until you were forced to with a company-wide playtest. And that might be 6 months before you play that level again, because you're really just focusing on your own work. And since there's not a lot of, you're not going into anyone else's stuff, you're just working on your own. But now we had to share a lot of things. We had to share specific files. So the IMs and the walking to deaths, and be like, when are you going to be done with Hex 321? Because I need it. I need to add some collectibles. Oh, later? Okay. So we had a lot of communication between designers, but we're also going into each other's stuff and fixing stuff, right? Because you don't, like I said, we had some horse blinders with being systems, but the thing with systems is the systems all interact with each other, right? So like take a mission, for example. Missions are probably the closest structure to old design generalists we had before, right? Because missions had objectives, and they had this linear structure to them, even if they were using open world spaces. So missions, for example, almost everyone went into missions, right? I was the open world designer, and I still edited every single mission in the game. And I didn't necessarily tell the mission designers when I went to edit it. Sometimes I would tell them, I'd be like, oh, I just changed this thing. But most of the time, you just had to have a lot of trust, right? Some other people were in your zones, other people were in your content, they were editing stuff, and you had to trust that they were doing what they needed to do. And it worked out, We had a lot of communication between the designers and a lot of shared work. Next is communication with art. So it kind of went into that, right? Because of how heavy that traversal system is, and how much it affected the level design in the world. So that also meant that even for designers that are not specifically related to building the geometry, if you wanted to move a car, if you wanted to add a new asset to a place, all these things had effects. The lighters hated it when you changed anything because it was a big effort to change lighting in the game. And then we had a lot of things dealing with, memory and theming of the world and stuff like that that art needed to keep control of. And since it's a hex-based streaming system, there are all kinds of other things we needed to worry about. So art was worried about people adding new stuff. And of course, designers were worried about art adding and changing anything that might have had to do with traversal, or accidentally placing a potted plant on top of a comic book collectible, but they couldn't see because it was in an overlay. So there's lots of back and forth between the art department and the design department. And what we ended up doing was we basically said, okay, you can't edit art, right? You can't move, designers can't edit and change art without getting approval, right? And that might sound like it kind of bogged us down with bureaucracy. But all it really meant was you shot off an email or you walked to Jason Priest's desk, I think he's giving a talk. Poor guy who constantly got walkouts. Basically, it was like, I need to move this thing. He's like, okay, thanks for telling me. And all that really meant was you had to keep people in the loop, right? You always had to keep designers and artists in a space on a loop, with changes in that space. Because most of the time there was no problem, but every once in a while it was a big problem to change something. And as a designer, it was and sometimes it didn't make any sense. Why would moving this air conditioning really have a problem, right? But they have their reasons, right? And so just keeping everybody in the loop, and that was sort of one of those demands that we had, changing stuff, we have to send an email out or have to walk to someone's desk. That meant that we were communicating with art much better. People were much more in the loop of the changes that were going on in those spaces. And then the last thing that really worked out well was communication with gameplay programmers. So we had tried at Insomniac before, lots of times, to try to get gameplay programmers, designers to work together instead of resenting each other, as may happen. And we even got to the point where we actually combined the department, right? So gameplay programming and designers are all in the same department. I think it's called the gameplay department. I'm not sure if I can remember now. So we're in the same department, and even that didn't get us working as close as we wanted. What happened was moving to systems made us work a lot closer, right? So And not just moving the systems, but also there was a lot of empowering the gameplay programmers to make more design decisions and be more informed about the design. So if somebody needed to move, if someone had a problem with a spawn point in a game, because that was one of my systems, right? Where does the player respawn when they die in the open world? They would come to me, or they'd come to the gameplay programmer, Paul, and we knew the exact same information, right? And then a lot of times they'd come to both of us at the same time. And there was a lot of this pairing together, right? Like you knew who was working on a system, and you could go with either the designer or the gameplay programmer, and they were constantly in communication with each other. And much more so than our previous games. Even though designers owned systems in our previous games, I think designers were still focused so much on their level and all the stuff that was going on in their level, and that doesn't really require a gameplay programmer for the level stuff, right? You're looking at gameplay programmers for that specific boss or that specific system, but you're still sort of focused on that. In this way, we had gameplay programmers that were focused on missions. So the mission designers could go to the mission gameplay programmers, and that was sort of like that pairing that worked really well together. So that's the good and the bad. I would definitely say that the good outweighed the bad. We did ship the game on time, and it was not as buggy as I might have expected for a first open world game, right? It worked out really well. So one question that I got when I first pitched this talk, and I got it from a couple sources, and I didn't know the answer to it at the time, was, are these changes permanent? Are designers at Insomniac now specialists, right? I mean, my tag says designer. Am I actually a designer, or am I the title level designer or combat designer or systems designer? Are the changes permanent? And the answer is no, we're not. So we changed the team structure to suit our new structure of game, right? And when Sunset Overdrive ended and a bunch of people rolled off onto Ratchet & Clank PS4 game, they went back to generalists, right? We're flexible. It's not an open world game, so there's no reason to continue using these necessarily practices because they don't necessarily work better for us in a linear game than our old process did. And then the other thing I want to point out before I end the talk, real close, is that I don't want you to take away from this talk and think, okay, they were specialists. The combat designers never touched a collectible. They were not allowed to. That's not true. We came from that tradition of generalists, right, where everyone was empowered to be able to do all the different systems. So that did mean, we went in and sometimes we futzed around with each other's systems. Not terribly so. And we also, we moved around roles as we needed to. This is our first open world game, and a lot of these systems like quests and challenges, we didn't really know how long does it take to implement a challenge when we started production, right? And when we found out, it was we have too many designers on that, or we don't have not enough designers on that, right? So we were flexible, since we expected all designers to be able to ramp up on anything related to design, and since no one was hired as the combat designer, that meant we could move people around, right? So we had challenge designers move into mission designers move into multiplayer designers, the combat designer moved into the mission. And so there was a lot of, there was flexibility going on. It wasn't, hard rules. But these teams, these ownership, really helped focus, what was going on, who was in charge of a thing at a time. But remember how intertwined those systems were with each other meant that even if the combat designers were the specialists in combat design and the people placing collectibles didn't have to learn anything about combat, everyone kind of learned a little bit about everything anyway, right? The horse blinders that I mentioned are more about dealing with various layers that you don't have to see at the same time. But everyone was kind of aware of how the systems worked. But maybe even if you weren't an expert on it, you knew enough about it that you could either make guesses on your own, or you knew, obviously, the owners of the system to go to next. So that is the end of my talk. Hopefully you liked it. I am ready for Q&A. Also, you can applause now. That's good. We have a few minutes. Oh, good. I'm not over time for once. We have a few minutes to just come up to the microphones, and I'll try to answer your questions. We'll start on that side first. Oh, okay. Can you speak on the pros and cons of using the hex system? Okay, so you asked the pros and cons of using the hex system. I can only really talk as a designer, because I'm not a programmer. And actually, at this very same moment, there's another talk on streaming in Sunset Overdrive and the pros and cons of the hex system across all the departments. So maybe the best person to ask is Elon. That's a hard question to answer. Because I was not responsible for building geometry, there were a lot of things that we didn't realize early on. Like, if you have a mission, I'm going to end up talking about the cons, sorry. But if you have a mission, right, and you're spawning enemies in that mission, that overlay is tied to a hex, right? The shadowed, right? So when that hex loads, that overlay loads, right, if you're on that mission. But what that means is if you had enemies and then you walked away, it's like, no, the enemies just disappear, right? And so you had a lot of problems with loading and unloading of content that normally we wouldn't have a problem with because we're not restricted to distances. So the fact that distance now, like when you got a certain distance from a hex, that hex would unload because that's how our system worked. We now had to deal with a lot of problems related to, I got too far away from a mission space, right? So like if you played the game, you might have gone into missions where, you're leaving a mission zone, you are going to fail. And that's because if you leave too far, you stream out the hex, and then when you come back, the hex has forgotten a whole lot of information, right? It doesn't know the state of the mission. So that's one of the big cons. One of the pros is it's really cool to play around in a game where it streams in and out. I don't know how, sorry. I don't have the best answer to actually the pros. I liked it.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. I think you were next.
Yeah. So you added on the negatives that you had designers not taking responsibility or accountability for the bugs that were interconnected with each other. So looking back and going forward, hopefully for your next open world title, what would you have done differently in order to make sure that at least somebody takes, even though it might not have been each other's fault, that somebody takes it upon themselves to fix these bugs?
So the question was, with hot potato bugs, right? How did we finally say, okay, we need to make sure someone fixes it? Yeah. And the answer to that is someone did fix it eventually, right? And it was various people picked up the slack on various parts of bugs, right? Especially in that last stretch where we just, had to finish the game. Going forward, I will say that that's something that we've identified as a problem, but I don't think we necessarily have a solution to it yet. Yeah. Beyond, we definitely identified it as a problem, and going forward, we need to not have that problem so much anymore. Right. But that's not a really good answer, but you understand?
No, it's understandable because with open world, there's not one person, one level. So when multiple people work on multiple aspects of the game, it's hard to make sure that, or have a pipeline in place that makes everybody accountable and responsible for what they're creating. So I was just curious to what your thoughts on going forward.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems was giving QA enough information to know who the bug went to. Because normally if it was a bug in a level, it went to the designer of that level. And then if it was art or audio, the designer would pass it on if it was really specific. But now if the bug happened in a mission, maybe it wasn't actually a mission bug. It was actually a bug in an open world system that was just there at the same time as the mission. Right. And so some of it comes down to it's really hard to untangle all of that. So some of it might come down to, communicating better, where the lines of the systems can be drawn, and give that information to QA in a more structured way so that they can get the bugs to the people who are responsible to them first, instead of to the wrong people who are just going to pass them around to possibly more wrong people until it ends up in the right spot. All right?
Cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.